This episode is brought to you by Early Innings, an anthology of the first 4 years of the Twin Bill. Featuring over 200 pages of baseball poetry, short stories, essays, interviews, comics, and art, it tells the story of what it means to love baseball today. The Athletic's Tyler Kepner said, like a box of ballpark Cracker Jack, there's a delightful surprise on every page of the Twin Bill's Early Innings. This is a collection to be savored, a loving and lyrical celebration of the art of baseball. Early Innings is available now from 406 Press. This episode is also brought to you by Ben Shahan's Short Relief. It asks the question of what happens when men are not ready to give up that boys' game, the national pastime. In 9 stories, he traces the stories of a minor league pitcher holding on to his last shred of hope for promotion to the show, little leaguers' formative experiences, and a host of men and boys in between. Short Relief is out on 406 Press and available at 406press.com. Welcome to the Twin Bill Podcast. I'm your host, Scott Bolohan. You don't see umpires like Luciano anymore. From his blow-ups with Earl Weaver to shooting at runners, he made the game fun. But there was so much more to Luciano. From his All-American football career to his still shocking death, Jim Leeke tells the whole story of the umpire in his new book, Big Loosh. We had a great chat. Enjoy. Welcome to the podcast, Jim. How are you doing today?
I'm doing very well.
I always start off by asking my guests, where does the idea for this book come from?
Well, I go way back, and I interviewed Ron Luciano during his first book tour in 1982 when I was a young feature writer. I did the story that everybody did. He was a big, personable, funny person, and that's the story you wrote. And then when he died tragically, almost 13 years later, I was out of newspapers by then, but I thought, gee, I really didn't do a very good job. And my contemporaries, for the most part, didn't do a very good job of understanding who he really was. So I made some notes at the time, put it aside, and years later, I decided I wanted to do a full biography of this very interesting man. And University of Nebraska Press was good enough to let me do it.
Yeah, I was going to ask, what was that experience like when you interviewed him? What do you remember about that?
It was at the St. Francis Hotel in San Francisco. I worked for a newspaper in Palo Alto, and at that point I was talking with quite a number of authors. And this was his first tour. He went everywhere. He was just all across the country. They really put a lot of marketing money into it. So I don't know where I stood on his interview list that day. I was probably number 5 or 6, who knows? But he came bounding into the room, this huge, personable man, just dominated the place, gave me a great interview, probably the same interview he gave 5 or 6 other people the same day. And I thoroughly enjoyed it. I enjoyed writing the piece. People liked being around Ronnie. That's the way I think of him now. A lot of his friends called him Ronnie. And I spent so much time with him that I think of him as Ronnie now. But as I say, there was much more to the man than he presented. He had this persona that he created, and he was very effective at using it and hiding behind it. So all those years later, after his death, I decided I'd like to know more about him and what his real story was, because the story he told the public when he was an umpire, when he was a broadcaster, when he was an author, was only a part of it. And much of what he presented wasn't entirely factual, let's say.
Yeah, I was going to get there. We can talk about that right now. So much of him is these big stories, this kind of big personality. And as you kind of point out in the book, they're good stories, but they're not necessarily true. Was this a complication for you when writing this book?
Well, it was in a way, yes. I realized early on that a lot of the narrative, a lot of his stories, what I call Luciano lore, wasn't strictly true. And that's not saying at all that I considered him a liar or a con man or a fake. He was just one of nature's great storytellers and entertainers. And sometimes I think, especially early on, he just got carried away and embellished his stories. And later on, sometimes he made them up out of whole cloth. But he was always entertaining when he did it. In the writing, it was a real challenge to come up with the facts. I mean, I only want to present the the literal truth in the book. I don't know whether I've succeeded at that. I'm sure there's something that has crept in that may have been exaggerated, let's say. So I tried very hard to check the stories, especially the popular stories, and I had to eliminate quite a number of them. I mentioned a few in the book, but there are so many other stories that are completely true, even though they sound like he made them up. He didn't. So it was quite a juggling act and quite an investigative process to come up with what really was going on.
I started reading this book and it opens with him playing football. And I'm like, am I reading the right book? That was a baseball book. It's like, no. He was quite the football player. Can you talk a little bit about his football career?
He was a great football player. He wasn't particularly good in high school in upstate New York because he was very large, very overweight, and not very well trained. But he got to Syracuse and played on the same club for one season with Jim Brown. I mean, he was in very good company and he had very good coach, and he made himself into an All-American his senior year. He was a great college football player, and he wanted more than anything to be an NFL player. He was drafted by the Lions, got hurt before his first session with the Lions. It was out all that first year. Wanted to come back the second year, got hurt again. 2 seasons on the payroll for the Lions, never played in an actual regular season game. He was cut by the Lions, of course. He was signed with the fairly new Buffalo Bills. Never played a game for them. Played essentially minor league football for a while. He played semi-pro football for a while. He never became what he wanted to be, and I think what he expected it to be. And I truly think it broke his heart.
So, you don't really hear a lot of stories about people going from professional football to major league umpire. How does he become an umpire? What leads him down that road?
Well, he wanted to get back on the field, any field, and he knew some umpires, and they talked him into it. They convinced him to go to an umpiring school in Florida. Ronnie, in his first book, tells this whole tale about how he was going to become the general manager for the Lakeland Tigers and the Detroit Tigers minor league circuit. It simply wasn't true. That's not what happened. He had already signed up for umpire school before this tale even takes place. He simply wanted to get back into sports, and he thought this was the best and most direct way. And he came up through the minors fairly quickly. He was a very good umpire in the early days. When he got up to the American League finally in 1969, he began to make a name for himself. And early on, he was considered one of the best umpires in the league. He started in the Florida State League in 1964, and he was in the American League in 1969. He went up, that's pretty quick.
Yeah, that's really quick. We're going to bring up this name a couple times, I figure, but while he's in the minor leagues, he meets Earl Weaver. What are these early interactions like with Earl Weaver?
Well, the early interactions are not what Ronnie put in his book.
Yeah.
In fact, before he even wrote the book, he was telling the story about how he threw Earl Weaver out of the first 4 games he ever umpired when they were both in the minors. That's simply not so. It's a great story, and it seems true, but it simply wasn't so. Early on, when the Weaver was with Utica, they met in an early series, and nothing much happened. And then in the second series, which is the one Ronnie referenced, he said he threw him out the first 4 games. In fact, he threw him out one of the 4 games, and he threw out Weaver's catcher, I think 2 of the others. It is true that they did not hit it off at the start or ever. Weaver got up to the majors a year before Ronnie did, and the antagonism continued in the majors. They had some great run-ins, almost legendary run-ins. They really didn't like each other. And Ronnie didn't dislike very many people, but he didn't like Weaver, and Weaver did not like Ronnie or really any other umpires.
Yeah.
Weaver detested umpires. So it wasn't only Ronnie that Weaver had a trouble. Uh,
I wanted to talk about his first game because he almost doesn't get to umpire his first game.
no, he's called up and he's supposed to umpire in Washington for Ted Williams, Senators. Only his umpire's uniform doesn't show up. Uh, but the tailor has sent it to the wrong place. So they actually call up another ump to take Ronnie's place in what was supposed to be his first game. And then MLB changed their mind. They said, okay, his pants showed up and he had a blazer that was close enough to the AL umpire's uniform that they let him wear it. But they already had four umpires, so they put him down one of the lines. And the fans had no idea who he was. Some of them thought he was a Secret Service agent because President Nixon was at the opening game. But he got well, he didn't really umpire the game. He was on the field. He didn't have to make any calls, but he was there.
Sure. He becomes known for, I don't know if you'd call him his quirks. He has a style. Maybe his style is perhaps the better way to phrase it. When does this start to develop, and what are some of these? What are some of his things he becomes known for?
Well, he played it fairly straight his first few seasons in the bigs, and he wasn't really having that much fun, and he knew it, and he thought he had to change something. So he says, okay, just relax. I'll let your personality show on the field. Otherwise, you're going to drive yourself crazy. So one of the things he was known for was shooting out players at first base. When he didn't call them out, he shot them out with his finger gun, out, 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 out. And he says in the book, and truthfully so, that the first person he shot out was Amos Otis of Kansas City. And according to Ronnie, it was because in the minors, he was never able, for some quirky reason, he could never call Amos Otis out. So when he got to the majors, he says, I got to call him out when he's actually out. So he shot him out, and it caught on, and other players start saying, shoot him out. Or sometimes they would say, take a shotgun to him. And so he started shooting people more than just Amos Otis. I say in the book that, you couldn't possibly do that today. Even playfully, you simply couldn't shoot somebody. But Ronnie and people of his generation and my generation, we grew up with Saturday morning cowboy shows. Nobody ever died. You would shoot the gun out of their hand and stuff. So Ronnie was being playful when he shot people. Also, these days, you don't see any umpires having fun. Joe West might have been the last one who actually had fun on the field. You can hardly name an umpire today.
I was thinking about this. You only know the bad ones, and
That's
if you
right.
know an umpire's name now, it's not for a good reason.
That's right.
And it sounds like for him, he was part of the show.
He absolutely was part of the show. And he enjoyed interacting with the players. And he enjoyed interacting with the fans just as much. I think it was one of his fellow umpires who tells the story that it was in Cleveland, I think, where Ronnie just sort of drags himself out of the umpire's room. He's not feeling particularly well, gets to the top of the stairs and sees the field and sees the crowd and steps out and sort of opens his arms like, here I am. Let's get this thing going. And he loved being on the field. He really did.
So is he, while he's, I don't know if you want to call it showboating or whatever he's doing, is he still respected by the players?
A lot of the players liked him and they encouraged his shooting out people and stuff like that. But conversely, a lot of players didn't like his antics, didn't like him chatting to them behind the plate. Just wanted, they wanted to get on with their game and they wanted him to play it straight. Early on, he was voted one of the top umpires by the players. That changed somewhat later as he began to be unhappy, I think, with his career and his performance level began to slip. But in the early years, when he was really enjoying it, everybody was enjoying it.
Yeah. Yeah. He's an interesting guy, and he was into Shakespeare. He was into bird watching. He opens a store. These are not things you necessarily assume umpires are doing. Maybe they are. I don't know. You just don't ever hear about it. But he seemed like a very
Yeah,
multifaceted person.
he was, and he was a very smart person. Some people even thought he was brilliant. But of course, that's the exact opposite of this character he created for himself. In interviews when he was an umpire, later on when he was an umpire, and in his books, he presents himself as this sort of big, ungainly, sort of uneducated galoot. This goof. And that simply wasn't who he was. He was very smart. He was a very good bird watcher, as you say. He was a lover of Shakespeare. In one of the AL season guides, they even called him a Shakespeare expert, which is probably going a bit far, but When he was on the road, his suitcase was loaded down with the bird watching manuals and Shakespeare plays. He was very smart on the road. An umpire's life can be lonely and solitary, so he filled it up with other things that kept him engaged, kept him entertained. The image fans of a certain vintage, the image they have of Ron Luciano was an image he created by and large.
1976. He's very famously quoted as saying, "I don't care who wins the pennant as long as it isn't Baltimore."
That's right.
Which is even reading it now, I can't help like, oh, that's shouldn't have said that. That's not great. What's the fallout from that?
Well, that remark came in a long interview with the Chicago sports writer after a rainout. And Ronnie gave, for the most part, a straightforward interview. But as he admitted later, he had a big mouth, and sometimes he spoke without thinking. And there's no way he should have said that, even as a joke. And he knew it, and he got called on the carpet, and he publicly apologized to Weaver and the team and to the fans, said he was going to try not to say something that stupid again. He didn't entirely succeed, but when he was in the wrong, he would admit that he was in the wrong. Weaver wanted him fired. They didn't fire him, but they did take him off Baltimore games for a while.
So I assume after this and everything with Earl Weaver and Ron are just fine, right? There's no other band.
Yeah. Weaver's run-ins with Ronnie and other umpires, you can still see him on YouTube and various other places. Weaver was just a terror, and he had no love of umpires, and he had no patience with umpires, and he didn't have much patience with himself or anybody else either. The interesting thing is, though, you would think from the stories and Ronnie's own writing that he had tossed Weaver dozens of times. In fact, he only tossed him 7 times.
You're kidding. That's
No,
incredible. The
7 times,
way
yeah.
the way that you hear about the two of them, and it just seems like there must be 25 times or something like that.
Again,
Yeah, yeah.
I was surprised. I had to check it, and no, 7 times, including twice in one day, both ends of a doubleheader.
I was going to ask you about the doubleheader. Yeah, we can talk about that next. Yeah. What happens in that doubleheader?
Well, Ronnie threw him out fairly early in the first game for beefing about a call. I think it was at first base. So he was going like it by the 4th inning. And then he threw him out when he came out to present the lineup cards before the second game because he brought up the same complaint he had from the first game. And Ronnie just wasn't having it.
That's great.
So he tossed him from both ends.
That's great. Toward the end of his career, reading the book, it seems like he kind of loses interest, perhaps, or just it doesn't appeal to him as much anymore. And he ends up retiring and he goes on TV, which in theory sounds like a great idea, this with this personality. How does he do on TV?
He was mixed on TV. He jumped to NBC Sports in 1980. And Ronnie said he had always planned on umpiring that season. The season before, 1979, had been very tough because there was an umpire strike. And he was the president of the Umpires Association. So he was a labor organizer. Really made it hard for him and every umpire and all of baseball. It was an unpleasant beginning to the season. And at that point, he wasn't enjoying it as much anymore. I wonder whether he wasn't experiencing depression at that point that he wasn't talking about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So he's all ready to start the 1980 season. NBC had used him previously to introduce lineups, that type of thing, on national sportscast. So they came to him. NBC came to him and said, "Why don't you interview? We can use you." And one of the reasons they wanted another broadcaster was they were getting ready for the 1980 Olympics, and they thought they were going to use many of their top people at the Olympics, which turned out not to be the case because we didn't go. But Ronnie interviewed with Merle Harmon and did very well, and they offered him a job. And just a couple of days before he was supposed to open the season, he took it and worked with Merle Harmon on Game of the Week, the alternate Game of the Week, not the main Game of the Week.
Right.
And people thought he was going to be great. And he was looking forward to it. And he did fairly well. A lot of critics liked him, liked his performance early on. He was pretty popular with fans. NBC used him and Merle Harmon, even in the World Series that year. The next year wasn't as good. I think he took the position too lightly. He really didn't do his homework. He famously mispronounced any number of player names, and slowly NBC edged him out. There was an option for a third year, and they didn't pick it up. So after 2 seasons, Ronnie was done. But coincidentally, by that point, he was also an author. So then he began yet another career.
Yeah, I wanted to talk about, first off, I mean, The Umpire Strike Back is really a landmark book, wildly successful. What about it led to its success? Do you have any idea?
Well, as I say, Ronnie was a natural born storyteller.
Mm-hmm.
And with
Yeah.
David Fisher as his co-author, he just brought that out. They went to a resort upstate New York, I think it was, and they sat down, and it was in the middle of winter, and Fisher just said, tell me the stories. So Ronnie did, and Fisher, captured them and shaped them and put them into the book, which was wildly funny. And fans and the critics just went crazy. I mean, it was a bestseller in no time at all. And Bantam Books put major bucks into the marketing too, which certainly helped. But Ronnie was very good at publicity. He just seems like his whole life had been building to that point. So when I and dozens, if not hundreds of other interviewers talked with him that year, 1982, he was a big success. I don't know how many feature stories and columns must have come out of even just that first tour. Hundreds, probably.
Mm-hmm.
And it was just an immense success, and fans loved it. Fans still love it. I talk to people who say, I've still got Ronnie's books on my shelf. 40 years later, I still got them. They're still hilarious.
Yeah. I mean, and this book kind of turns him into a public figure. I mean, he's on SNL. He's out there, This
Yeah,
is an umpire. This is crazy.
that's right. That's right.
Yeah.
He's on. He introduces SNL during a supposed rain out, and then when it finally starts raining on the stage, he says live from New York at Saturday night. He's on Johnny Carson any number of times. He's on every big late night talk show that there is. He's sort of a contemporary of Bob Uecker at that point.
Yeah.
The funny baseball man. That's a great interview and a great guest. And there was some indication that Ronnie might have a TV career of his own. It never quite worked out. But one of the things I read and didn't believe, and it turned out to be true, was that he interviewed for the role of Coach on Cheers. And had he got it, he probably would have been
Yeah.
good at it. My own pet theory is that he looked too much like George Wendt. The two of them couldn't have been in the same cast.
Yeah.
That's what I tell myself anyway.
I like that theory. He seemed so full of life and so happy to play the role or the character that he had created for himself that when you read about his death, really, it's been 30 years, but from really the height of his fame until his death, it's a decade, just about, a little bit more than that. How do you sort of reconcile that? Do you think you kind of have an understanding of where he was at that point in life and any idea what was going on with him?
Well, I think there was a slow private decline.
Mm-hmm.
He wasn't an umpire anymore. He wasn't on TV anymore. The books gradually phased out. He did 5, and each one sold like progressively fewer than the ones before. I mean, the early ones were big hits, but by the end, the 5th book barely made a dent.
Mm-hmm.
In the last 5-7 years of his life, he didn't do a lot. He did some TV commercials, he did some print commercials, but less and less over time. And by the early 1990s, he was at home, living at his old home in Endicott, New York, in what had been his mother's home and was now his home, even though she was still alive. And he gradually faded from public view. He did a few TV appearances in Binghamton, New York, that type of thing. But he slowly faded out of the public consciousness. Some of his friends worried about him somewhat. They thought he was too isolated. But day to day, he seemed fine. He shocked a friend of his in New York when he admitted that he had put himself into a hospital suffering with depression. Nobody knew that.
Mm-hmm.
His friend literally was shocked. He couldn't imagine it. His beloved mother had Alzheimer's, no longer recognized him, even though he went to where she lived every day. As I say, I think he had been dealing with depression for quite some time before he even admitted it. contacted his family when I was doing this book, and they very politely but firmly declined to speak. Police report about his death, it can't be found anymore. It's probably destroyed.
Mm-hmm.
The short version is that one day in January 1995, he went into his garage, ran a hose from the tailpipe into the front, and sat there till he passed away. And he had invited a young friend over to work on something in the house, and the friend came and found him, and he was shocked. This was a very close friend. He couldn't believe it. He can't believe it to this day. Some people had worried about him, but not to that extent. There are any number of things that could be part of it. I mean, depression obviously was a big part of it. He was a football player, and now, of course, we know that that can damage your brain and often does. And Ronnie played football for a long time. Who knows? I don't think there's one thing that triggered it.
Yeah.
Any number of things could have contributed. He left a note for his family, which they didn't make public, but they said the one thing he wanted the people to know was that wasn't anything related to drugs or alcohol. His sister said she thought that he had just felt he contributed as much to the family as he could, and his time was up. So it was a very sad story. As I mentioned earlier, when he died, I thought about the story I had written, and I'm sure many, many, many journalists thought about the stories they had written and wondered, how did this happen? How did we not see this? And of course, in the research, I can't even tell you how many articles I've read, stretching over decades, and there weren't more than a handful, including an interview Ronnie himself gave to a sports magazine. There weren't more than a handful where there was even a hint of the darker side to his life. He was so good at concealing that, so effective at presenting this persona that everybody loved, that when he died, it was really shocking.
Yeah. I mean, you obviously you got to meet him. You spent a lot of your life now reading and learning about him. How do you remember Ronnie now?
Well, I like to remember him as he came bounding into that room at the St. Francis in San Francisco. I mean, he really did come bounding in. This huge man that just dominated the space. So friendly, so cheery, so outgoing. I'm sure I thought at the time that this was to some extent an act, and now I know it was. But that doesn't diminish the pleasure of having been there and seeing him and meeting him. And it doesn't diminish the books. It doesn't diminish the interviews or the TV clips you can see. It adds an edge of sadness to it, but Ronnie was Ronnie, and he wouldn't want people to be upset or feeling badly after reading about him. I think he would want them to maybe understand now that there was much more to him than he was presenting. At least I hope that's what he would think. I hope that he would approve, or at least not disapprove, of having me write his biography.
Yeah.
I think towards the end he would have liked people to know the real story. I don't know. He was such a private person. It's hard to know what he would think about it now. But I tried to be as fair to him as I could, and I don't want to make the book sound depressing. People wanted me to write a book that sort of paralleled his books. I didn't even attempt to do that. I didn't attempt to make it riotously funny. But this was Ronnie. He was a funny man. So there is an awful lot of humor in this bio.
No, it really is a fascinating book about a fascinating person who was such of the time and a place, and it's a joy to remember and think about him. Thoroughly enjoyed reading the book.
I'm glad, because you couldn't possibly have any memory of Ronnie yourself.
No, I had no. I. It's one of those things where I think when I was a kid, I read his book. I read Umpire Strikes Back, and I never saw him. I never saw him umpire or anything like that. And so just to understand that there was a person out there in baseball like that, it makes you love the game a little bit more. I really enjoyed the book. You did a great job.
Great, thank you. Don't you wish there was an umpire like Ronnie out there now?
That was Jim Leeke. His book, Big Loosh, The Unruly Life of Umpire Ron Luciano, is out now. We talk to people in and around baseball literature every week on the podcast and publish around 50 writers every year in the Twin Bill Literary Journal. Until next time,